For 1,000 years, this hole had devoured those who were brought here in chains, those who couldn't refuse, and not a single one survived. And then a man stood before it, nameless, unarmed, with no reason whatsoever to be there. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the vortex didn't know what to do with him. But let's go back. The first thing Dan senses is a smell, burnt resin and something sweet, as if someone were burning honey in a hot skillet. Then comes the sound, a low hum of dozens of voices. Not a scream, not a whisper. It's the way a crowd hums at a funeral when the coffin is already being lowered. Dan opens his eyes and sees the sky instead of a ceiling. Red, not sunset red, red like an inflamed wound. He's standing on a stone floor in the middle of a huge amphitheater. Steps lead upward, and on each one stand people in long gray robes. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Torches burn along the walls, and shadows dart about as if trying to crawl away. Dan doesn't remember how he got here. The last thing left in his memory is a crash, a heaviness in his chest, someone's face very close, a young guy, scared, then darkness, then that smell. He turns his head and sees the altar, black stone, smooth, shining as if wet. A girl lies on the altar, a white dress. Her slender arms are tied to stone rings. Her eyes are closed. Her lips are moving. She's whispering, a prayer or a farewell. And something is hanging over her, a funnel, a black hole as tall as a person. It rotates slowly and emits a sound that makes his teeth clench and his vision darken. Not even a sound, pressure, as if all the air had become 10 times heavier. Dan backs up and presses his back against the stone railing. It's low, waist high, and this is where the strangest part begins. The funnel descends lower, slowly, like a hand reaching for an apple on a table. Only the apple is a girl, and the hand isn't going to take her, it's going to drink her. Dan sees it. He doesn't know how, but he sees it. The funnel is drawing something out of her. Not blood, not air. Something deeper. The skin on her wrists darkens. Thin black lines crawl upward from her rings along her arms, like cracks in porcelain, like the roots of a poisonous tree. The girl clenches her teeth. A tear rolls down from the corner of her eye, and the crowd on the steps hums evenly and indifferently. Spectators who have seen this show 100 times. No one moves. No one screams. For them, this is how it should be. Dan looks at his hands, empty, no weapons, no magic, nothing at all. He looks at the girl. The black lines have reached her elbows. She's breathing fast and shallow, like a bird in a fist. She's looking at the funnel. It has dropped even lower. It's almost touching her chest. And then something clicks inside him. Not a thought, not a decision. His body moves before his mind. He steps over the railing. One priest turns his head. Dan knocks him aside with his shoulder. The second raises his hand. Dan walks past without looking. He stands between the altar and the funnel, facing the black hole, with his back to the girl. The singing stops. Silence falls over the amphitheater like a landslide. 1,000 people fall silent at once. The funnel freezes. 1 second, 2, 3, and then it rushes at him, as if the ocean had decided to pour through a keyhole. Pain, but not the kind he's used to. Not a fracture, not a burn. 1,000 strangers' screams burst into his head all at once. Girls, women, old women. Each one had once lain on this stone. Each one had given up what had been torn from her, and all that weight poured into Dan. He collapses to his knees. His palms press into the stone. His teeth are clenched until they grind. Blood from his nose splatters onto the white stone. The funnel presses down, breaks him, burns him out. It knows how to do this. It's been doing it for 1,000 years. It takes those who are dragged in chains. It drinks those who cannot refuse. But Dan wasn't brought here. He came on his own. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the vortex doesn't know what to do with him. The pressure trembles. It doesn't weaken. It trembles, like a mechanism that's caught a pebble. Dan catches this pause, this glitch. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know why he's standing there. But he doesn't back down. The funnel strikes again. The full weight of 1,000 years crashes down on a single man, nameless, powerless, with no reason to stand here. And he holds his ground. Not because he's stronger, but because he doesn't care what happens to him. He does care what happens to her. The funnel chokes. The black stream twitches. It freezes and flows back. Not outward, into Dan. No longer a blow, like water into an empty vessel. What was meant to kill becomes something else. The curse is turned upside down. The pain doesn't go away. It changes form. Instead of 1,000 screams, 1,000 whispers come. Quiet, weary, grateful. The vortex collapses. Dan remains on his knees, blood from his nose, a tremor throughout his body, a ringing in his ears. But he's breathing, and the girl behind him is breathing too. The black lines on her arms freeze. They don't disappear, they freeze. The amphitheater is silent. Not a single priest moves. On the steps, someone faints. Someone sinks to their knees. Dan stands up. His legs won't hold him. He turns to the girl. She's looking at him. Her eyes are huge, wet, and there's no gratitude in them. There's terror, because she knows what he's done, and she knows it's impossible. The priests erupt in a scream, all at once, commands. Someone pulls him by the arm. Someone drags him away. The high priest steps right up close, grabs Dan by the chin, turns his face toward the light, stares for a long time, then lets go and steps back. He tells the others that this man has taken the funnel into himself, that nothing like this has ever happened before, that he must be isolated until they understand what has happened. Dan is led away. A long corridor, stone walls, torches every 10 paces. A small room with a stone bench and a heavy door. They lock him inside. Dan sits down on the bench, leans against the wall, closes his eyes. Whispers still echo in his head. Quiet voices, names he doesn't know, faces he hasn't seen. The girls who lay on this stone before him, hundreds of them. Each left a piece of herself in the curse, and now all those pieces are inside him. He doesn't understand anything, where he is, what happened, why he's alive, what kind of black hole this is, what kind of temple, what kind of people. He knows only one thing: the girl on the altar is breathing, and that is enough for now. The door opened a few hours later, maybe a day later. Time didn't exist in the windowless room. 2 people entered, a woman in a gray robe with a high collar and sleeves that reached her wrists. Behind her was a younger girl, the very one, from the altar. The black lines on her arms were still visible, fainter than before, but they hadn't disappeared. They crept from her wrists to her elbows like frozen cracks. The woman in gray stopped at the door and looked at Dan, the way one looks at an unfamiliar animal. Not with fear, with calculation. She said her name was Sister Yeren, that she was the senior nun in this wing of the temple, that the girl's name was Liora, and that Dan had to explain who he was and where he came from. Dan said he didn't know. It was the truth. Yeren asked again. He repeated it. She asked which order he belonged to. He said none. She asked who his teacher was. He said he had no teacher. Yeren fell silent. Then she asked if he knew what he had done to the seal's funnel. Dan said he had stood before it. That was all. Yeren looked at him for a while. Then she turned to Liora and said that he was either a liar or a madman. Liora didn't answer. She was looking at her wrists. The lines on her skin were pulsing, slowly, like a second pulse. Dan saw this, and he saw something else, not with his eyes, with something new, something that remained within him after the wound. The black lines on Liora's skin weren't just marks. They were a structure, a pattern, like a diagram, like a blueprint. Every line led somewhere and clung to something. He saw the attachment points. Here, the knot goes deep and holds on to something in her chest. Here, the branch splits in two, and one half is dead while the other pulls. Here, there's a completely extra loop. not attached to anything, just dangling, like an extra part in a mechanism that someone forgot to remove. Dan got up from the bench. Yaren tensed. He said he could see her mark. Yaren said that only the highest-ranking sealers could see the bride's mark. Dan said he didn't know what sealers were, but he could see it, and he could see that it was assembled crookedly. Yaren opened her mouth and closed it. Then she said that the bride's mark was a sacred bond between the chosen one and the abyss, and it couldn't be assembled crookedly because it wasn't assembled by people. Dan looked at the lines again. Then he said that whoever assembled it clearly hadn't read the instructions. This knot isn't needed at all. It's hooked onto her fear, not her body, her fear. Take away the fear and the knot will hang in the air. But this one is hooked onto guilt, specific guilt, something about her sister. Liora flinched. Dan stopped. He looked at her. He asked if her sister was alive. Liora pressed her lips together and shook her head. Dan nodded. He said that this knot was clinging to the feeling that she had survived in her sister's place, and that it wasn't her feeling. It had been added on, like a prop, to make the brand stick tighter. Yaren took a step forward. Her face changed. It didn't soften, but something in it cracked. She asked if he could remove it. Dan honestly said he didn't know, but he could try. He sat down on the floor across from Liora. She looked at him and trembled. He held out his hands, palms up. She didn't move. Yaren quietly told her she could refuse. Liora looked at her wrists, at the black lines, at the quiet pulsation that was slowly draining the life from her. Then she placed her palms on his. Dan closed his eyes and dove into the drawing. From the inside, it looked different. Not lines, a net, a huge, heavy net thrown over something light and warm. Every knot was like a lock, and every lock had its own key. The first knot, fear. Not abstract but concrete. Darkness, a small room, his mother's voice behind the door. Words about how Lior had been chosen, that it was an honor, that she shouldn't cry. Dan felt that fear as his own. His throat tightened. His hands went cold. He took the knot and pulled, carefully, like pulling out a splinter. The knot gave way. It detached from the fear and hung there, dead. Pain washed over Dan like a wave of hot water. Not physical, someone else's memory. A little girl in a white dress stands in front of the temple and doesn't cry because she was told not to cry. Dan exhaled. The second knot, guilt. Lior's sister, 2 years older. She was supposed to be chosen first, but she fell ill, just a fever. She died 3 days before the ceremony, and they chose Lior. The knot of guilt was enormous, heavy. It had grown deep. Dan pulled at it slowly, thread by thread. Each thread was a memory. How her sister had taught her to braid her hair. How they'd hide together in the garden from their mentors. How, on the last night before her sister's death, Liora had promised she'd live for both of them. And then she was led to the altar, and the promise turned into a noose. Dan untied the knot. The pain grew stronger. His voice cracked. His throat went dry, as if after a scream. The third knot, the extra one, the one that wasn't tied to anything. Dan tugged at it, and the knot fell apart on its own. A dummy, a prop. Someone had added it to make the brand look more impressive. Dan opened his eyes. He looked at Liora's wrists. The black lines were fading, slowly, like ink underwater, one by one. The pulsing slowed, weakened, stopping. A few minutes later, only clean skin remained on Liora's wrists. Pink, warm, alive. Liora looked at her hands and couldn't breathe. She tried. Her chest rose, but no air came. And then it broke through. She inhaled so deeply it was as if she hadn't breathed in years. And she cried. Not quietly, not beautifully, loudly, ugly. Like a person who had been given back they had forbidden themselves to dream of. Yaren stood by the wall. Her face was still, but her hands were shaking. She had seen the bride's brand hundreds of times, on dozens of girls. She had escorted them down into the dark chapels from which they never returned. She knew the brand could not be removed. Everyone knew. 7 generations of priestesses knew. And this man, who didn't know what a stamper was, sat down on the stone floor and removed it in 10 minutes. Yeren slowly sank to her knees, not before Dan, before what had happened. Dan didn't notice. He was looking at Liora. Then he wanted to say that everything was fine, but his voice wouldn't come out. His throat tightened. Someone else's memories were stuck in his throat like a lump. A little girl in white, a dead sister, a promise to live for both of them. He swallowed it down. He stood up. He leaned against the wall. He closed his eyes. Footsteps sounded behind the door. Many footsteps, quick ones. Someone had seen what happened, or someone had heard Liora's crying. The door swung open. 4 priests stood in the doorway, more people behind them. They were looking at Liora, at her clean wrists. The first priest asked what had happened here. Yeren rose from her knees. She squared her shoulders. Her voice was steady. She said that this man had removed the bride's brand. The priest said that was impossible. Yeren lifted Liora's hand and showed her wrist. The priest fell silent. For a long time. The news spread through the temple like smoke. Not quickly, but inevitably. By the morning of the next day, the whole district knew about it. A man without a name or an order had removed the bride's brand. The sacred, unbreakable, eternal brand. Removed it like a bandage from a cut. Dana was moved from the stone cell to a larger room. A window, a narrow bed, a table, a jug of water. No honor. Quarantine. They wouldn't let him out. They came to him, priests in pairs. They asked the same questions over and over. Who sent him? Which clan he belonged to? Where he had studied the printing trade? Dan answered the same thing every time. No one. None. Nowhere. They didn't believe him, but they couldn't disprove it either. His voice returned on the second day, hoarse, quiet, but it returned. The first person he asked to see was Liora. They refused him. Then Yeren came, alone. She sat on a chair by the door. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that Liora was fine, that the brand hadn't returned, that the priestesses had examined her 4 times and each time her skin was clear, that Liora wasn't speaking, not because she couldn't, because she didn't know what to say. All her life she had known one thing, that she would die on the altar. And now there was no altar, and she didn't know what to do with that. Dan nodded. He asked if he could talk to her. Yeren said no, that the temple council decides his fate, that the word heresy has already been spoken twice. Dan asked what that meant. Yeren explained. In Velgrave, the seal isn't just protection. It's a contract between the living and the abyss. The abyss doesn't rise, and the living feed it through the brides. Anyone who breaks the contract isn't just a criminal. They're a threat to the whole world. Because if the abyss doesn't get what's due to it, it will open up. And then it won't be just one temple, but all the cities. Dan listened. He took it all in. He didn't argue. Then he asked how many brides there had been before Liora. Yeren paused. Then she said that in this temple, over 300 years, there had been 41. Dan asked how many of them were still alive. Yeren didn't answer. Dan understood. Not a single one. He asked how often they chose brides now. Yeren said that before, it was once every 7 years. Now, once every 5. In the capital, already once every 3. Dan asked why more often. Yeren said that the seals were weakening, that each feeding lasted less and less, that no one knew why, that they didn't speak of it aloud. Dan sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at his hands. Something still lived in them after yesterday. Warmth, or heaviness, or both. He told Yeren he wanted to see the others, the ones with the brand, the ones being prepared. Yeren said there were 3 more girls in this temple with partial brands. They aren't being led to the altar, not yet. The brand is applied 2 years before the feeding. Slow preparation. The body gets used to the connection with the abyss. The mind gets used to the thought of death. By the time a girl is laid on the altar, she's already half gone. Dan asked if he could see them. Yeren said that was up to the council. Dan said that by the time the council decided, the mark would have grown another 2 fingers width. Yeren looked at him long and hard. Then she stood up and left. On the 3rd day, it wasn't Yeren who came to his door. A woman in dark leather armor with short hair and a scar running from her temple to her chin came. A knife in a cracked sheath hung from her belt. She entered without knocking. She stood by the wall. She crossed her arms. She looked silently. Dan looked back at her. She said her name was Cassell, that she was a curse hunter, that she had been sent to check whether he posed a threat. Dan asked to whom. Cassell said to everyone. Dan said he was sitting in a stone room without a weapon, drinking water from a jug. Cassell didn't smile. She said a threat doesn't always look like a sword. Sometimes it looks like hope, and it kills more people. She took a scroll out of her bag and unfolded it on the table. Numbers, tables, lines, a map with markings. She said these were statistics on the blight over the past 20 years. Places where the abyss breaks through to the surface. Black corruption, turning beasts into monsters, people into shadows. 20 years ago, there were 6 in all of Velgrave. 10 years ago, 12. 5 years ago, 23. Now 38. And those are only the ones they know about. The outskirts don't report in anymore. There's no one left to report to. Cassell said the hunters are the only ones who see these numbers. The temples know, but remain silent. The knower knows, but bargains. The hunters count. And the numbers all say the same thing. The system is dying. The brides can't hold on anymore. Each feeding is weaker than the last. The abyss is starving and has begun to feed on itself. The abscesses aren't a glitch. They're a symptom. Dan looked at the map, at the marks clustering toward the outskirts like a rash. He asked what the hunters do with the abscesses. Cassell said they cauterize them. They pour cleansing oil on them and apply a small seal. It lasts from 3 months to a year. Then the abscess opens up again, sometimes 2 instead of 1. Dan asked if anyone had tried to close an abscess any other way. Cassell asked what he meant. Dan said he didn't know, but a small seal is like putting a bandage on a wound that's rotting from the inside. A bandage doesn't heal, it just covers it up. Cassell looked at him with something new in her eyes. Not warmth, attention. She said she'd come to assess the threat, but she found a man asking questions she herself had been afraid to answer for 10 years. She folded the map, put it in her bag, said she'd come back tomorrow, and left. Dan didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Castle's numbers swirled in his head, along with the voices from the funnel and the smooth skin on Liora's wrists. 41 brides in 300 years in a single temple. How many temples in Velgrave? How many brides in 1,000 years? Thousands, tens of thousands, each tied to a stone, each drained to the last drop. And every time, the system asks for more, no less, more. It doesn't work. He didn't understand this world, didn't know its history, didn't know its rules, but he knew one thing. If the mechanism devours more and more and works worse and worse, it means it's broken. Not weak, broken. And it needs to be fixed not with more fuel, but by taking it apart. He lay down on the bed, closed his eyes. Voices from the funnel whispered quietly in the darkness. He listened to them until he fell asleep. Castle returned the next day, and the day after that. She brought maps and charts and dry reports from the hunters on the outskirts. Dan read. Or rather, he tried to. The language of Velgrava was different from his own, but it came more easily with each passing day. Something inside him was adjusting. Maybe a gift. Maybe his brain. He didn't know. On the 5th day of his confinement, he asked Castle for one thing. To bring him girls with partial brands. Castle said that the council wouldn't approve. Dan said that over these 5 days, their marks had grown even more. He could feel it, through the walls. 3 dark spots in the temple building, each one slowly expanding. Castle left. She returned 2 hours later. Yeren was with her. and 3 girls. The first was Nell, 16 years old, thin, quiet. The brand had reached her shoulders. The black lines were visible even through the fabric. The second was Sunye, 17. The brand was in its early stages, just her wrists. She was shaking so hard she couldn't stand straight. The third was Tammy, 20. The brand had spread up to her neck. She wasn't trembling. She was looking past Dan, past the walls, past everything. She was already half gone. Dan started with Tame, because she had the least time left. He sat down across from her. He held out his hands. She didn't move. He waited. Then he said he wouldn't do anything until she decided for herself. Tame turned her head, looked at him, for the first time all day. There was something dim and distant in her eyes. She asked why. Dan said because she didn't have to die. Tame said she had to, that she could already hear the abyss's voice, that it was warm, that it promised peace. Dan felt a chill run down his spine. He closed his eyes and looked at her brand from the inside. It was different, not like Liora's. Liora's brand was held in place by fear and guilt. Tame's had grown into a desire to leave, into weariness, in quiet acceptance that this was right. There were more knots. They were deeper, and they didn't cling to pain. They clung to peace, to the promise that it would all end. That was harder. Removing pain is one thing. Removing peace is another. Like taking away a person's only blanket in the cold and saying you've brought a better one. You actually had to bring a better one. Dan started with the outer knots, the small ones, the ones that held the brand to her skin. With each knot he untied, a piece of someone else's life was given to him. Tame grew up in the southern parish. She was the third daughter. The first 2 had been taken to the altar before her. Her mother stopped giving her daughters names until they were 5. Why bother if they'd be taken away anyway? Tame received a name at 6. Too late. She had already grown accustomed to being nobody. Dan kept this to himself and pulled the knots further, the middle layer. It was harder here. The knots had grown into the memory of her sisters, not in grief, in envy. Tame envied the dead. They were no longer afraid. They were no longer waiting. They were free. Dan pulled these knots out one by one. Each one beat him from within, not with pain, with longing. A deep, gray longing that doesn't scream but gently settles on your shoulders and presses down until you stop breathing. He was breathing, with effort, through a wheeze, through clenched teeth. The last knot sat deep, beneath all the others, small, vivid. It was a memory. Tame in her mother's arms. She is 2 years old. She doesn't have a name yet, but her mother sings, softly. Not words, a melody. And Tame is holding onto her finger, just one finger, and that's enough for her. The knot clung to that memory like a root to the last clod of earth. Dan pulled. The knot wouldn't budge. He pulled harder. Blood flowed from his nose, hot, down his lips, down her chin. The knot gave way. It came loose. Dan exhaled. He opened his eyes. Tame was looking at him. Her eyes were wet. Clear. Clear for the first time in a long time. The black lines on her neck were fading, receding, like the tide. She raised her hands, looked at her wrists. Clean. She looked at Dan. He looked terrible. Blood on his face, white as a sheet. His hands were shaking. She asked if he was in pain. Dan said no. It was a lie. But she didn't need his pain. She needed clean skin and a morning she hadn't counted on. Yeren led Sune to him. Sune was trembling. Tears were streaming down her face even before Dan reached out his hands. Her brand was fresh, shallow. The knots held together by a single fear. Fear of the ceremony, of the funnel, of what she had seen 2 months ago when another girl was placed on the altar and screamed for 12 minutes until the funnel took her voice. Dan removed it in 5 minutes, carefully, gently, like removing a bandage from a still fresh wound. Sune stopped trembling. She looked at her hands, and for the first time in 2 months, She smiled. A small one, crooked, but genuine. Nell was last. She sat down across from Dan and said nothing. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She just waited. Her brand was heavy, not as deep as Tame's, but wide. It covered her like a net. Many small knots, dozens, each clinging to something, to petty grievances, to the words of the mentors, for the cold nights in the temple, for the smell of resin from the torches, which she hated because that was exactly what it smelled like when they took her friend away. Dan untangled them one by one, patiently, methodically, like untangling a knot in long hair, thread by thread, knot by knot. It took 20 minutes. By the end, blood was streaming from both of Dan's nostrils, and he couldn't lift his arms. Nell stood up. She looked at her shoulders where the lines had once been visible. Nothing. Clean. She turned to Yeren. She was standing by the wall. Her face was stony. Her hands were clenched into fists. Nell asked quietly, "Is it true?" Yeren nodded. Dan fell back onto his back. He lay flat on the stone floor. The ceiling was spinning. The voices of the three girls were spinning. Everything was spinning. Cassell crouched down beside him. She asked if he was alive. Dan said he needed water and to lie still for a couple of hours. And food, if there is any. Cassell snorted. For the first time in all their meetings. Short and sharp, almost a laugh. She said he'd just removed 3 brides' brands in a row. 3 brands that were considered eternal. And the first thing he asks for is food. Dan said curses are curses, but he's hungry. The rumor had spread beyond the temple walls. Dan knew this from the way the priests' faces had changed. The first few days, they'd looked at him with suspicion. Now, with caution. Not because they feared him, because they feared what would come after him. By the end of the first week, the temple council had reached a decision. Not a trial, not a pardon, supervision. Dan was allowed to move freely within the temple grounds, but with conditions. Yeren was held personally responsible for him. 2 priests accompanied him outside the temple, and he was not allowed to leave the grounds without the council's permission. Dan agreed. He had nowhere else to go. The temple precinct turned out to be larger than he'd thought. The central temple, 4 small chapels around it, residential quarters for the priestesses, barracks for the temple guard, a small market beyond the wall, villages in the surrounding area. Several hundred people for whom the temple was the center of their lives. Dan stepped outside the walls for the first time on the 8th day. Morning, cool air, the smell of wet grass and smoke. The sky was normal, gray-blue, not red like on that first night. He asked Yeren why the sky had been red then. She said that during the feeding, the abyss rises closer to the surface. The sky reacts. When the funnel is active, the world reveals for a moment what lies beneath it, and beneath it is red, always red. Dan remembered that. Liora came out to him on the 9th day. He was sitting in the courtyard, trying to make sense of the scroll Cassell had given him. A table of abscesses, numbers, dates, coordinates he couldn't read. Liora sat down next to him, silently, for a long time. Then she said she didn't know why she'd come. Dan said she didn't need a reason. She could just sit there. Liora nodded, and just sat there. They were silent for maybe half an hour. Then she asked what he was reading. He showed her the table. She looked at it. She explained the coordinate system. She showed him which district was where. She explained that each abscess was marked with a color based on its level of danger. Red meant a creature spawn. Black meant a shadow zone. There were no people there anymore. Dan listened. She spoke with growing confidence. Minute by minute, her voice grew stronger. Her shoulders straightened. She knew this world. She had grown up in it. It was just that for the last 5 years, she had been preparing to die and had stopped thinking that anyone needed her knowledge. Dan said he needed her help, that he didn't understand anything about this world, that without her, he couldn't even read a map. Liora looked at him as if he'd said something impossible. Then she nodded. On the 10th day, Castle arrived with news. A hunting post 2 days' journey from the temple had sent a signal. A festering wound. Fresh. It opened 3 days ago in a field outside the village of Tarnholm. The small seal isn't holding. Black slime is oozing from the ground. 2 peasants are missing. One returned, but he's no longer human. A shadow. A screaming shadow that casts no shadow of its own. They burned him. Castle said they're sending her to clean it up. Standard procedure. Oil. Fire. The small seal. It lasts from 3 months to a year. Dan said he wants to go with her. Castle said no. Yaren said no. The council will say no. Dan said the small seal is a bandage. He wants to try something else. Castle asked what exactly. Dan said he doesn't know, but he feels he can. When he was removing the brands from the girls, part of the curse settled inside him. Not like poison, like energy. Heavy, dark, but controllable. He hadn't tried giving it back yet, but his gift told him he could. Not as a weapon, as creation. To patch it up, to seal it, to grow something over the wound. Castle was silent. Then she said that if he died there, she wouldn't pull him out. Dan said he hadn't asked her to. Yaren said she wouldn't let him go unescorted, that if he died outside the temple, the council would hold her accountable. Dan said she could go with him. Yaren looked at him as if he were crazy. Then she said yes, she would go. They set out at dawn on the 11th day. Dan, Castle, Yaren. 2 temple guards who walked at a distance and tried not to look at Dan, and Mira. Mira appeared at the temple gates that morning, 17 years old, short dark hair, light hunter's armor, 2 short blades at her belt. She introduced herself as Castle's partner. Castle said she hadn't asked for backup. Mira said she wasn't backup. She was curious. Cassell gave her a hard look. Mira held her gaze. She smiled, widely, defiantly, like someone who's used to smiling to keep from crying. Dan sensed it, not for nothing, just from experience. He knew that smile. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough. The journey to Tarnholm took a day and a half, on foot, across fields, through a grove. Mira walked beside Dan and didn't stop talking. She told him she'd become a hunter at 15. That hunters aren't an army or an order. They're women who see corruption, a rare gift, 1 in 1,000. They patrol the borders of the Blightlands, burn the creatures, set seals, and bury those they couldn't save. She said her older sister had been a hunter too, had been. Mira said the word without a pause, without changing her voice. She simply slipped it into the sentence and moved on, like someone who had long since learned to avoid a pothole on a familiar road. Dan didn't ask for details. They saw Tarnholm by evening on the 2nd day. The village lay in a hollow, a dozen houses, stone walls, thatched roofs, quiet, too quiet. No smoke from the chimneys, no people on the streets, no dogs. Cassell raised her hand. Everyone stopped. She sniffed the air. Then she said one word, corruption. Dan felt it too. Not a smell, pressure, like in an amphitheater, only weaker, distant, lingering. They skirted the village. The people were alive, locked in their houses. Eyes watched them through the cracks in the shutters, frightened, dark. The abscess was beyond the village, in the field. They didn't have to look for it. A black spot the size of a house. The ground had swollen, cracked. Something dark oozed from the cracks. Not liquid, not smoke, something in between. It crept across the grass, and the grass turned black and curled up. Dan stepped closer. Cassell grabbed his shoulder. She said he couldn't go near the edge without protection. Dan said he was the protection. Cassell didn't let go. Dan looked at her, then at the abscess. Then he said he'd at least take a look. Just a look. He closed his eyes and activated that vision, the gift. Reading the curse. From the inside, the abscess looked like a wound. Open, deep. The edges were ragged. From the depths rose the same dark current that had been in the funnel, only weaker, thinner, as if the funnel were a river and the abscess a stream from that same river. The structure was familiar, the same nodes, the same anchors, but not to a person, to the earth, to a stone, to tree roots, to the memory of the place. Someone had been buried here once, not with honors, without, long ago. Dan opened his eyes. He told Cassell that the abscess was clinging to something in the ground, to an old sorrow. Cassell asked what he was going to do. Dan said he'd try to close it, for real, not with a bandage. He walked to the edge of the abscess, dropped to his knees, placed his palms on the black earth, and let it go. All that weight he'd accumulated from 5 removed brands, all the foreign pain that had settled in him like sediment. He didn't push it out, he directed it, like a stream of water into a crack in the wall, to fill it, to flood it, to grow over it. The earth trembled, the black sludge froze, then it began to recede, slowly, like the ebb tide. The cracks in the ground were closing, not disappearing, they were drawing together, like the edges of a wound healing. Mira stood nearby with her mouth open. Cassell stood with hers closed, which was worse. The process took 10 minutes. By the end, the abscess had closed. In its place remained a patch of scorched earth, black but dry, dead but not poisonous. The curse was gone. The pressure vanished. Dan withdrew his hands. They were shaking. He was empty. All the accumulated energy had gone into the ground. Every knot, every foreign memory he had given away. Tame in her nameless childhood. Soon in her 12 minutes of horror. Nell and her dozens of small wounds. Liora and her dead sister. All of it went into the ground, and the ground accepted it, and closed. Cassell approached. She sat down beside him. She took a flask out of her bag. She handed it to Dan. He drank. Water. Plain warm water. The best thing he'd ever tasted. Cassell said quietly, 3 months. That's how long the small seal lasts. She asked how long his would last. Dan said he didn't know. But the structure is closed, not sealed. Closed. The knots are untied. There are no hooks. The abscess has nothing to hold on to. Cassell took out a scroll. She wrote it down. Date, location, method, result. For the first time in 10 years of hunting service, she was recording a closure, not a loss. Mira sat down next to Dan, silently. Then she said he looked terrible. Dan said thank you. Mira smiled. For real this time. The return trip took just as long, but they walked differently, more quietly. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts. Cassell walked ahead and stopped several times to jot something down on the scroll. Yaren walked beside Dan and said nothing. But her silence was different, not like a guard beside a prisoner, like a person next to another person. Mira walked behind and was silent too, which was unusual for her. The guards lagged 20 paces behind and spoke quietly among themselves. Dan felt empty, not in a bad way, empty. All the energy from the removed brands had drained into the abscess. All the foreign memories, all the voices, all the images, given to the earth. Inside, there was silence, a strange, unfamiliar silence, like a room from which all the furniture had been removed. They returned to the temple district by evening. Liora met them at the gate. She was standing in the shadow of the wall, and when she saw Dan, she stepped forward and stopped immediately, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to. Dan approached her himself. He said everything was fine, that the abscess was closed. Liora nodded. Then she said that while he was gone, she had read everything she could find in the temple library about the brand. 3 scrolls, 1 treatise, the records of 7 generations of priestesses. Dan asked if she had found anything useful. Liora said yes. All the records say the same thing. The brand cannot be removed. Hundreds of attempts over the centuries, not a single one worked. And every record ends the same way. The brand is the will of the abyss, and the will of the abyss is unbreakable. Liora paused. Then she said that in none of the records had anyone tried to take the brand apart piece by piece. Everyone had tried to remove it whole, like a lid off a cauldron, by force. But Dan was pulling at the threads, one by one. Dan looked at her. It was the first time she'd spoken at length. The first time she'd thought out loud. The first time she hadn't apologized for taking up someone else's time. He said she should write this down. Liora blinked. She asked why. Dan said because if something happened to him, someone had to know the method. Not the magic, the method. Liora opened her mouth. She closed it. Then she nodded. News of the sealed abscess reached the temple council faster than Dan himself. Castle sent a messenger bird from the road. By the time he returned, the council was already in session. Yeren was summoned to report. She returned an hour later. Her face was impassive. She said the council didn't know how to react. Some believed it was a miracle and should be used. Others thought it was heresy and had to be stopped. Still others felt it didn't matter what it was as long as it worked. The votes were evenly split. Until a decision is made, Dan remains under supervision. Dan said that while they were voting, another abscess opens up somewhere. Yeren said she knew, and that she had already submitted a request to extend his access. Dan was surprised. Yeren didn't explain. The next morning, a cart pulled up to the temple. An old woman sat in it, small, hunched over, skin like parchment, eyes cloudy but alive. On her wrists, neck, and face, the black lines were so dense they looked like tattoos. The bride's mark. Old. Very old. The accompanying priestess said this was Mother Eloise, the bride of the seal, the 34th in this district. She was 81 years old. She had been laid upon the altar at 20, 61 years ago. The mark had consumed almost everything. Her eyesight, hearing in one ear, her height. She used to be taller. The mark had been squeezing her for decades like a fist squeezes a rag. But she survived, the only one out of 41. Not because she was stronger, but because, for some reason, the brand couldn't finish her off. It caught on something and got stuck. The priestesses said it was holiness, that the abyss had spared her for her purity. Eloise was brought to Dan not at his request, by order of the council. It was a test. If he removes the 60-year-old, it meant he was the real one. If he couldn't, it meant the first miracles were a fluke. Eloise was led into the room. She walked slowly. Every step felt like climbing a staircase. She sat down across from Dan. She looked at him with cloudy eyes and said one thing. Don't. Dan froze. Eloise said she had been wearing that brand for 61 years, that it had become a part of her, that without it, she didn't know who she was. Bride of the Seal is not a sentence. It is a name, the only one she has left. Dan sat quietly. He didn't argue. He stared at her brand in vain and saw something that made his throat tighten. 61 years, thousands of knots, layer upon layer, year after year. The brand had grown into her like a tree grows into a fence, impossible to remove without damaging it. But he saw something else, too. He saw that the brand was still pulling, slowly, drop by drop, day by day. In a year or two, it might finish the job. And then, not even a scrap of parchment would remain of Eloise. He told her this, quietly, without pressure. He said the brand hadn't stopped. It had just slowed down, and that it would finish the job. Eloise was silent. Then she asked how he knew. Dan said he could see it, like seeing a crack in a wall. It's still holding, but it's creeping. Eloise was silent for a long time. A minute, two. There was no sound in the room except her breathing, raspy, heavy. Then she held out her hands, palms up, and Dan began. It was like diving into the ocean. 61 years of someone else's life. 61 years of pain and humility and quiet anger and quiet gratitude and quiet anticipation of the end. There were hundreds of knots, thousands. Dan couldn't untangle them one by one. There were too many. He started differently. He started at the root, with the very first knot, the one that had been tied 61 years ago at the altar. Eloise at 20, beautiful, tall, chestnut hair, hazel eyes. She didn't cry as they led her away. She sang, the bride's hymn, the one they teach from childhood, and she believed every word. She believed that her death would save the world, that it was an honor, that she would be remembered. The first knot held fast to that belief. Dan tugged. The knot wouldn't give. 61 years of conviction were pulling back against him. Dan changed his approach, not to pull, to untie, to show that faith is not a lie, but that it is not complete, that one can believe in sacrifice and still want to live, that one does not negate the other. The knot trembled, it loosened, it came undone, and the rest followed in its wake, like an avalanche. Dozens of knots tied to the first one collapsed, hundreds clinging to dozens, thousands clinging to hundreds. Dan didn't sort them out, he accepted them, as if standing beneath a waterfall. 61 years of someone else's life passed through him in a matter of minutes. He saw everything, every day in the dark chapel, every dawn that Eloise didn't see because there are no windows in the chapel, every priestess who brought her food and wouldn't look her in the eye, every night when the brand tightened just a little more, and in the morning there was just a little less of a face in the mirror. Blood gushed from his nose, then from his ears. Dan didn't stop. The last knots were the oldest. They had turned to stone. He broke them with his hands. Not with his hands, with what was in place of hands inside that space. With will, with stubbornness, with the habit of never backing down. The last knot snapped. It crumbled, and Dan emerged. He opened his eyes, blood on his face, on his hands, on the floor. Eloise was sitting across from him. The black lines on her skin were fading, receding, like darkness before dawn. Her face was changing, not getting younger, just smoothing out. The wrinkles remained, the years remained, but the tightness was gone, as if the fist that had been clenching a rag for 61 years had finally unclenched. Eloise straightened her back, slowly, vertebra by vertebra, shoulders back, head up. She had been a little old woman. She had become a little old woman standing upright. She looked at her hands, clean, wrinkled, old, but clean. Not a single dark line. She looked up at Dan. Her cloudy eyes were wet. She said nothing. She just sat there and looked at her hands. Yaren stood by the door. Tears streamed down her face. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't even notice. Cassell stood nearby. She wasn't crying, but the scroll in her hands was trembling slightly. Dan tried to stand up. He couldn't. His legs wouldn't hold him. Mira took him by the arm. She told him to stop playing the hero and that he needed to lie down. Dan didn't argue. He lay down right on the stone floor next to a pool of his own blood. The voices of 61 years ago buzzed in his head like a swarm, not angry, tired. Eloise was still sitting there, staring at her hands. Then she said quietly that she'd forgotten what her skin looked like without lines, that it was beautiful, that she didn't remember skin could be like that. Dan lay there for 2 days, not because his body was failing. His body was intact. The usual dark circles under his eyes, and weakness and a dry mouth. But in his head were 60 years of someone else's life, and those 60 years wouldn't settle quietly. They tossed and turned. They rose at night. They replayed the same scenes over and over. Eloise, at 22, walks into the chapel and the door closes behind her. Eloise, at 35, loses sight in her left eye, and the priestess says it is a gift from the abyss, that this is how saints see. Eloise, at 47, stops remembering her face before the branding, and this frightens her more than anything else. Eloise, at 61, hears the next one being led to the altar behind the wall and cannot scream because her throat has long since stopped obeying her. Dan lay there and relived it all, not as his own memory, like someone else's pain that cannot be put on the shelf. It simply is. It stands behind his shoulder and breathes into his ear. On the third morning he got up. He washed his face. He went out into the yard. The sun hit his eyes. He stood there with his eyes closed, just breathing. The air smelled of rain. Liora found him 10 minutes later. She brought water and bread and something like porridge with herbs. She set it down beside him. She said nothing. She sat across from him. She waited for him to eat. Dan ate slowly. The porridge was bland. The bread was hard. The water was warm. The best meal of his life. He asked how Eloise was. Liora said that Eloise was sleeping. She sleeps a lot. For the first time in years, without nightmares. The priestesses can't explain it. The brand always brought dreams. Dark, heavy dreams in which the abyss calls. Now there's no brand and no dreams. Eloise just sleeps, like a child. Liora paused. Then she said she had started writing things down, as Dan had asked, a method. The structure of the brands, types of knots, what they cling to. She divided the knots into 3 categories: knots of fear, knots of guilt, knots of humility. Each type behaves differently when removed. Fear knots are the easiest to release. They're strong but fragile. It's enough to show there's nothing to fear, and they crumble. Guilt knots run deeper. They cling not to the fear itself, but to the memory. They must be pulled carefully, or something inside the person will tear. Humility knots are the most dangerous, because the person doesn't want them removed. They've grown accustomed to them. They've become their home. Dan listened and nodded. She was right. Everything matched what he'd seen. He said that Eloise had a 4th type as well, knots of faith, the ones a person has tied themselves. They weren't branded on them, the person accepted them. Liora thought for a moment. Then she nodded. She took notes. They sat and worked. Not like a hero and his rescued, like 2 people figuring out a problem. Dan saw from the inside. Liora systematized from the outside. Together, something resembling understanding began to take shape. By noon, Cassell arrived. She wasn't alone. A woman followed her, tall, broad-shouldered, short gray hair at her temples, though her face looked no older than 30. A scar on her neck ran under the collar of her armor and disappeared somewhere on her back. Heavy eyes, tired, not from lack of sleep, from age. Cassell said this was Hawan, commander of the 3rd hunting squad. Dan nodded. Hawan didn't nod back. She looked at him appraisingly, the way one looks at a horse before buying it. Teeth, legs, will it hold up on the road? She said she'd heard of him, that her squad was patrolling the southern sector, that there were 14 active abscesses there, that over the past year she'd lost 7 out of 23, that the young ones don't last, that every month one of her girls doesn't return from patrol. She said all this in an even voice, without a tremor, without a pause, like reading a list of supplies. Dan heard 20 years of that behind that voice, 20 years of going to the abscesses and 20 years of returning with an empty spot in the ranks. She asked if it was true that he had closed the abscess in Tarnholm. Castle confirmed it. Hawan asked if it was for good. Castle said it wasn't known for sure, but the structure was completely closed, not sealed, closed. Hawan was silent for a moment. Then she asked Dan directly, could he close 14? Dan said he couldn't yet, that every closure required energy, that he obtained energy by removing brands, that it wasn't an infinite resource. He had to first take on someone else's pain in order to then give it back to the earth. Hawan asked how many brands were needed to close one medium-sized abscess. Dan thought for a moment. Tarnholm was small. 5 brands had been enough for him. A medium abscess, according to Castle's reports, was about 3 times larger. So 15 would be needed, maybe 20. He said that was a rough estimate. Hawan nodded. She did the math in her head. Then she said that in the entire southern sector, there were about 30 women with partial brands in various stages. If they were all removed, that would be enough for 2 abscesses, maybe 3, out of 14. Castle added that this was assuming the brands weren't reapplied, and the temples were continuing their preparations for the feeding. New brides, new brands. The conveyor belt didn't stop. Dan listened. The numbers added up in his head. Bad numbers. He could remove the brands. He could close the abscesses, but one at a time. And the problem was growing faster than he could fix it. It was like in a warehouse. When more orders come in than you can pick, you can work faster, you can work longer, but if you don't stop the flow, you'll drown. You have to stop the flow. He said it out loud. That treating the abscesses one by one was a dead end, that they needed to understand why they were opening up, that the system was breaking down not because there were too few brides, but because something was wrong with the mechanism itself. Hawan looked at Castle. Castle looked at Hawan. Something passed between them, understanding, or confirmation of something they'd both known for a long time. Castle said she needed a week, that she wanted to gather all the data on the abscesses from the past 50 years, to look for patterns, where they open, when, how quickly, whether there was a connection to the feedings. Dan said that was fine, that while she was calculating, he would be removing the brands. Every brand removed was energy for the future, and one life saved now. Haewon said she would send women from the southern sector to him, those with brands, those who can still be saved. Dan nodded. Yurin, who had been standing silently by the wall the whole time, said she would need more rooms, and better food for those recovering, and clean bandages, because after the brand is removed, the girls aren't just free, they're broken. They need a place to put themselves back together. Dan looked at her. She wasn't looking at him, at the wall, at a point somewhere far beyond the wall. She was planning. For the first time in all her years at the temple, she was planning not a funeral, but a cure. Mira raised her hand. Everyone looked at her. She said that while everyone was making plans, someone could feed Dan because he eats like a stray cat once a day, and at this rate, he'll collapse in a week. Haewon looked at Mira. Mira held her gaze. Haewon didn't smile, but for a second, something in her face softened. She said the girl was right. They went their separate ways, each with their own task. Castle to his charts, Haewon to send a message to the southern sector, Yurin to organize the rooms, Liora to continue her notes, Mira to find where they hide decent food in this temple. And Dan sat alone in the courtyard. The sun was setting. The shadows were lengthening. He looked at his hands. Empty, powerless, unmarked. Nothing. Tomorrow, women with black lines on their skin would start arriving. He would film them. He would take on their pain. He would lose his voice and spill blood on the stones, and then give it back to the earth, close the circle, pain into him, from him into the earth, from the earth, silence. It wasn't heroism. It was an assembly line, warehouse work. Receive, process, give back, next. They began to arrive on the fourth day after the meeting with Haewon, in pairs, in threes, women from distant parishes, young and not so young, with brands at various stages. Some walked on their own, others were brought in on carts. One was carried on a stretcher because her legs would no longer obey her. The brand had reached their thighs, and their muscles were beginning to waste away. Yeren set aside the west wing of the temple for them. 7 rooms, clean beds, water, food. Liora greeted each one. She wrote down their names, the stage of the brand, how many years ago it was applied, every detail. She did it calmly and precisely, like someone who had found work that made sense. Dan took on 2 a day. He couldn't handle more. After 2 removals, his voice would disappear for several hours, and his hands would tremble until morning. Every brand was different. Each clung to its own story. A 24-year-old woman named Rissa carried a knot tied to her firstborn. The child was 2 when his mother was taken away for training. The brand clung to the tear, to the moment when the boy was snatched from her arms. As Dan removed that knot, he relived the entire moment. The child's scream, the priestess's cold hands, the corridor stretching into the distance, ending in darkness. He left the room after Rissa and sat against the wall in the courtyard for 20 minutes, unable to speak. Not because of a sore throat, because of a stranger's scream in his head. Mira found him. She sat down next to him. She didn't say anything. She handed him a mug with something hot in it. He drank it. Herbal tea. Bitter. Mira said that Cassell had told her to pass on that the data for 50 years had been collected and that he should take a look when he could. Dan nodded. He asked how she was. Mira shrugged. She said she was fine, that she was helping Yeren with her accommodations, that she was bringing her food, that she sharpens blades in the evenings because she's used to it and her hands get restless. Then she paused and said that one of the women brought in today from the southern sector knew her sister. Dan looked at her. Mira didn't look away. Her eyes were dry. Her voice was steady. She said her sister's name was Hana, that Hana was a hunter in Haewon's unit, that 3 years ago, on patrol near a large abscess, one of the creatures broke through the perimeter. Hana shielded the younger one with her body. The creature struck. The small seal on Hana cracked. The corruption poured in. By the time Haewon reached her, Hana was already a shadow, a screaming shadow. They burned her on the spot. Mira told all this calmly and quietly, as if reading from a report. Then she said that a woman who knew Hana had told her a detail Mira didn't know, that after her death, a posthumous mark remained on Hana, the small seal that had cracked. It hadn't dissolved. It had been imprinted on the spot where Hana had stood, in the stone. And the stone is still there, on the side of the road in the southern sector, black, with lines. Mira didn't ask anything. She just sat there, holding the mug in her hands and staring at the wall. Dan understood. She wasn't asking, but he heard her. He said that when they got to the southern sector, he would find that stone. Mira turned her head. There was something fragile and sharp at the same time in her eyes. She said she didn't need pity.
Dan said it wasn't pity. It was a craft. The brand is there. That means it can be removed. Mira blinked. Once. Quickly. Then she stood up and left, with quick steps, without looking back. In the evening, Dan went to see Cassell. She had laid out maps and charts on the large table in the library room. 50 years worth of data. Hundreds of entries. Cassell had been working on it for a week, and now there were markings on the map, colored, by year. The pattern was immediately apparent. The abscesses didn't open randomly. They opened in waves, and each wave began 2 or 3 years after the next feeding. Cassell said it wasn't a coincidence. The feeding was supposed to seal the abyss for 7 years. But instead, 2 to 3 years after the feeding, the abyss begins to break through more fiercely than before, as if the feeding doesn't satisfy it, but angers it. Dan looked at the map. Waves, one after another, stronger with every decade. As if every time the abyss is given a bride, it calms down for a while and then starves even more furiously. He asked Cassell if anyone had seen this before her. Cassell said yes, that 3 hunters over the past 20 years had filed reports with similar conclusions. The first was removed from duty. The second was transferred to a distant outpost. The third disappeared. Cassell said this without emotion, just a fact. 3 women saw the truth. 3 women fell silent. Dan asked why Cassell wasn't keeping quiet. Cassell looked at him for a long time. Then she said it was because there had been no point in speaking before. You can speak when there's someone to listen, and when the one listening can do something. She showed him another map, the capital, the central temple, the place where the great feeding is to take place in 4 months. Not an ordinary one. The great feeding. Once every 50 years. Not 1 bride. 7. At the same time. 7 girls on 7 altars. A funnel 7 times more powerful. The temples have been preparing for this for 3 years. 7 girls have already been selected. The brands are already growing on them. Castle said that if her data is correct, the great feeding won't save the world for 50 years. It will trigger a wave of pustules that will engulf all of Velgrava 3 years after it happens. Not tens, hundreds, thousands. It will be the end. Dan looked at the map of the capital. 4 months, 7 girls, and one of them. Castle turned the page. Names, 7 names. The third name on the list, Princess Seyon, heiress of House Solvin, a family that, over 1,000 years, had given more daughters to the seals than any other. Seyon was 21. She was next. Dan read the name, then the other 6. 7 names, 7 lives, 4 months. He said they needed to go to the capital. Castle said she knew, that she'd been waiting for him to say it himself. It was a 3-week journey to the capital. Dan couldn't wait 4 months and then run. They had to arrive early, figure things out, find those 7, understand the structure of the capital's temple, and convince someone that the great feeding was not salvation, but a catastrophe. The last part was the hardest, to convince people that a 1,000-year-old tradition was a mistake, that all the sacrifices had been in vain, that their daughters and mothers and sisters were dying not to save the world, but to make the end just a little slower and a little more painful. Dan understood that you couldn't approach people with that. It wasn't an argument.
It was a blow. He needed facts. We need numbers. We need proof. Castle gave him both. Tables, graphs, correlations between the feedings and the waves of pustules. Everything was meticulous, all triple-checked. But Castle said the data wasn't enough, that the hunters only see the surface, that the real records of the seals and the feedings are kept in the conclave in the capital, locked away behind 7 locks.
And that without them, any argument is just the word of a hunter against the word of the supreme sealer. They set out at dawn. Dan, Cassell, Yaren, Mira. Liora stayed behind. Not because she didn't want to, because someone had to keep working in the temple. Women with brands kept arriving. Liora knew the method. She couldn't remove the brands herself, but she could explain. She could prepare. She could welcome them. Dan said goodbye to her in the courtyard. She stood straight, hands at her sides. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She looked at him and said nothing. Then she told him to come back. Not a request, not an order, just words. Quiet, heavy. Dan said he would return. Ha-Wan was waiting for them at the county border. She decided to go with them. Not because she believed Dan, because her girls were dying and she wanted it to end. With her were 4 hunters from her squad, young, silent, with the eyes of people who had seen too much for their age. The group of 9 headed southwest, toward the capital. The road ran through the plains, through fields, through villages that grew larger and quieter. The silence was a bad sign. Cassell explained that quiet villages were the ones that knew about the blight nearby. People don't leave. They have nowhere to go. But they stop going out into the fields after dark. They stop letting children go beyond the fence. They stop laughing loudly, because the creatures are drawn to sound. On the 5th day of their journey, they stumbled upon an abscess. Not a large one, a medium-sized one, on the side of the road. The ground was swollen, black sludge, the smell of sweet rot. Ha-Wan stopped the group. She looked at Dan. He understood without words, but he had no energy left. He hadn't removed the brands since leaving the temple. He was empty. There was nothing to seal the pus pit. He said so. Ha-Wan nodded, without disappointment. She simply accepted it. They walked around the pus pit and moved on. But Dan memorized its location. And one more thing. When he stood at the edge and looked down, he saw that the abscess was connected to something deep below. Not just a crack in the ground, a channel, a thin, dark channel leading downward, to the abyss. And there were many such channels. He could feel them, like the roots of a tree spreading out in all directions. This abscess was not a wound, it was an exit, one of hundreds. The entire land of Velgrava was riddled with these channels, and the abyss lay beneath it all, beneath every field, beneath every village, beneath every temple. Not like a lake, like an ocean. On the 7th day of their journey, they reached Hana's stone. Mira didn't mention it. She didn't ask. But when the road turned and Ha-Wan slowed her pace, Dan saw Mira turn pale. The stone lay on the side of the road, an ordinary boulder, gray, flat. But there were black lines on its surface, sharp, as if carved. A posthumous mark, the trace of the curse that killed Hana. Mira stood 3 steps away from the stone and couldn't get any closer. Her hands clenched into fists, her face stony, her jaw clenched. She wasn't crying. She wasn't breathing. Dan approached the stone. He dropped to his knees. He placed his palms on the cold surface, and he activated his vision. The posthumous mark was different, not alive, not growing, frozen, like a photograph. The moment of death sealed in stone. One knot, one single knot, huge, vivid. The moment of impact. The creature breaks the seal on Hana's chest. The corruption surged inside. And in the last second before becoming a shadow, Hana wasn't thinking of herself. She was thinking of the girl behind her. Would there be enough time? Would she manage to escape? That was the last thing left of Hana, caring for someone else's child at the moment of her own death. Dan pulled at the knot. It gave way easily, as if it had been waiting.
as if Hana had been waiting. Dan had no energy left. But the posthumous mark didn't require energy. It only required someone to come and say it was over, that the service was finished, that it was time to let go. The knot came undone. The black lines on the stone faded. They melted away. The stone became just a stone, gray, warm from the sun, ordinary. Dan took his hands away. He turned to Mira. She was standing in the same spot, 3 steps from the stone. Tears streamed down her face, both cheeks, her chin. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't hide. She just stood there and cried, for the first time in 3 years. Haewon stood a little way off. She wasn't looking at Mira, at the stone, at the bare stone. She knew Hana. She had been there when Hana died. She was the one who set the shadow on fire. Her hands were shaking. She hid them behind her back so no one would see. Mira walked up to the stone. She dropped to her knees. She placed her palms on the warm surface. She pressed her forehead against it and fell silent. They stood around her in silence. No one hurried her. No one said it was time to go. 5 minutes. 10. Mira stood up, wiped her face with her sleeve, turned to Dan, wanted to say something, couldn't. She just nodded, once, briefly, and walked forward along the road. First, they continued on their way, in silence. The silence was different, not heavy, pure. On the 10th day of their journey, they saw the capital, the city of Soltar. It rose on the horizon like a stone forest. Walls, towers, temple spires, smoke from thousands of chimneys. Something was flickering above the city center, dim, barely noticeable, like a mirage over hot earth. Castle said it was the Great Seal, a protective dome over the central temple. It had held for 800 years, fueled by every feeding. If it fell, the abyss would rise right beneath the capital. Dan watched the shimmer, yet he saw something else. The seal was not a dome. It was a bandage, a huge old bandage stretched over a wound that had never healed. And beneath the bandage, everything was rotting. The capital greeted them indifferently. 9 people in the road dust, hunters, a priestess, a man without an order and without a name. The guard at the gate checked the marks of Cassell and Hawan, hunter tokens. They were let through without question. Hunters come and go. No one cares. The city was enormous. After the temple district and the empty highways, Soltar was overwhelming. Narrow streets, 4-story stone houses, people everywhere. Merchants, artisans, guards in dark blue cloaks, priests in gray robes. Many priests, more than in the district. Here, the temple was not the center of the village. Here, the temple was the authority. Cassell led them through the lower city to the hunting lodge, a building on the outskirts of the temple quarter. Unremarkable, gray stone, no signs. Inside, cots and tables and maps on the walls and the smell of gun oil. Haewon knew the local commander, a woman in her 40s named Torin, short hair, lean. She greeted them without surprise, assigned them rooms, fed them. She didn't ask why they had come. Hunters don't ask each other why. Dan lay down on a cot, and for the first time in 10 days, slept on something softer than stone. He slept for 14 hours. In the morning, Mira woke him up. She said that Cassell had already left, to the archives. The hunters had access to some of the temple records, not all of them, but enough to get started. Dan washed up, ate, went out into the city with Yeren. She knew Soltar. She grew up here. Before she ended up in the temple district, she was a novice at the central temple. She knew the layout of the buildings, knew the names. She knew the hierarchy. Yeren led him through the streets and explained. Soltar's central temple isn't a single temple. It's a complex. The main hall for the feasts, the residence of the conclave of seals, the library, the underground chapels where the brides live out their days, the barracks of the temple guard, and the chamber of names, the place where the names of every bride from the past 1,000 years are kept. Dan asked if he could go there. Yeren said the chamber was open to everyone. It was a place of remembrance. People come to pray, to light a candle, to read their great-grandmother's name. They went. The Hall of Names occupied a separate building next to the central temple, A circular hall, high ceilings, walls covered with names, thousands of names, carved into stone, gilded letters. Every name is a girl. Every name is a life given to the abyss. Dan stood in the center of the hall and looked at the walls. The names ran in rows, from bottom to top, the oldest at the top, thousands of years old, the most recent ones at the bottom, at eye level. The last name was carved 2 years ago. Next to it, 7 empty spaces, for the next 7, for the great feeding. He reached out and touched the wall. The gift responded. And Dan saw. Every name carried a trace, not a mark, an echo, an imprint of the life that had been given. Thousands of echoes, thousands of voices. The wall hummed with them, quietly, like a beehive. He withdrew his hand. His head spun. Too much, all at once. He couldn't take in 1,000 lives at once. But he felt one thing. Grief. Deep. Ancient. Not malicious. Grief. The wall was saturated with grief like a sponge with water. Each name added a drop. Over 1,000 years, an ocean had accumulated. And this ocean did not disappear. It flowed downward, through the stone, through the foundation, into the earth, into the channels, into the abyss. Dan stepped back from the wall. He looked at Yeren. She was standing at the entrance. Her face was motionless, but her eyes were red. She had been here before. She knew these names, some personally. Dan told her one thing, that the abyss does not consume life, it consumes grief. Every bride gives not strength, but suffering, and the abyss accepts it, and grows even hungrier, because grief does not satisfy. It multiplies. Yeren asked how he knew. Dan said he felt it, that the wall isn't a monument, it's a pipe, a direct channel down. The victims' names feed the abyss not with strength, but with pain. Everyone who comes here to cry adds to it. The system doesn't feed the abyss. The system feeds its hunger. Yeren was silent. Then she said that if that was true, then everything the temples had done for 1,000 years hadn't just been useless. It had made things worse. Dan nodded. They left the chamber in silence. Mira was waiting for them outside. She was pale. She said she'd found something, that there were people standing by the hunting lodge, in dark blue cloaks, the temple guard, and that they were asking about a man without a badge who was removing the brands. The rumor had reached the capital before they did. Cassell returned by evening, with data and news. The data confirmed everything. Records from the capital's temple spanning 300 years. Every feeding, every wave of abscesses that followed. The curve was rising, steadily. The great feeding 50 years ago had caused 13 abscesses in the first year. The one 200 years ago had caused 4. The next one would cause hundreds. And the news was worse. The Supreme Printer Orville knew about Dan. He hadn't just heard, he knew. He had been briefed on the removal of Eloise's brand, on the closure of the abscess in Tarnholm, on the women being healed in the Temple District, and he hadn't declared Dan a heretic. Not yet. Cassell said that Orville was a smart man, smarter than many in the conclave. He wouldn't act without understanding the situation. He would want to see, to understand, and then decide how to use it. She said the word use with particular emphasis. Dan asked what she meant. Cassell said that Orville had been looking for a way to make the system cheaper for many years, not to abolish it, not to break it, to make it cheaper. Fewer brides, fewer victims, fewer protests. If Dan can remove the brands and close the abscesses, then Dan can become the perfect replacement. One eternal battery instead of 1,000 brides. The system will survive. The abyss will be fed. Just instead of the girls, it will be him. Forever. Dan was silent. Then he said that this was worse than what we have now. Cassell asked why. Dan said because right now, the system kills, and everyone sees that it kills. And sooner or later, someone will ask why. But if they put him in the girl's place, everything will look humane. No one dies. Everyone's happy. And the question of why will never be asked, which means the abyss will never be closed. Cassell looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was thinking further ahead than she'd expected. Mira said that was all wonderful, but the temple guard was looking for him, and maybe he should think about how not to get caught before his plans to save the world came to fruition. Hei-wan said that the hunting lodge was the hunter's territory, not the temple's. The guard has no right to enter without a warrant from the conclave. As long as Dan is inside, he's safe, but he can't go out anymore. Dan said he needed to see Se-yeon, one of the 7, the 3rd name on the list, the princess. Hei-wan said that Princess Se-yeon is at the Solwyn residence, under guard, under supervision, under a stigma that grows every day. You can't just visit her like that. Cassell said maybe not, that she has a contact, a maid at the Solwyn residence, a former hunter. She left the unit after being wounded and entered service. She can pass on a note. Dan said he didn't need a note. He needed 10 minutes with Se-yeon, face to face. He had to see her brand, to understand its structure, and if it's like what he's seen before, he'll be able to remove it. And if it isn't, he fell silent. Cassell asked, what then? Dan said that then he'd need more time, but he'd remove it anyway. Cassell's contact worked on the 3rd day. A maid at the Solwyn residence relayed the reply. Princess Se-yeon agreed to a meeting, not because she believed in miracles, because she had 3 months left and she wanted to look into the eyes of the man who supposedly defies death. The meeting was set in the garden by the side wing of the residence, at night, with no witnesses. The maid would lead Dan through the service entrance. 10 minutes, no more. The guards changed shifts every half hour. Dan left the hunting lodge after sunset. Mira walked with him, not because she'd been asked to, because she'd said that if he were caught alone, no one would know where to look for the body. Dan didn't argue. They walked through Soltar at night. The streets were empty, streetlights every 30 paces, long shadows. The temple guard patrolled the central quarter, but the side streets were clear. The maid was waiting by a low door in a stone wall. She nodded silently. She led him through a narrow corridor that smelled of dampness and old wood. She led him out into the garden. Trees, stone paths, a fountain that wasn't working, and a bench in the far corner. A girl was sitting on the bench, back straight, hands on her knees, hair pulled back. Her face was calm, flawless, like a porcelain mask. Dan approached. He stopped 3 steps away. Se-yeon looked at him, not with hope, not with fear, with the curiosity of a scientist studying a strange insect. She said she'd heard about him, that the temple district was buzzing, that the priestesses were whispering, that the conclave was silent, and that meant the conclave was afraid. She asked if it was true that he'd removed the brand from Mother Eloise. Dan said it was true. Se-yeon was silent for a moment. Then she held out her hands. On her wrists, the black were thin, neat, almost beautiful, not like Liora's, not like Tame's. These lines looked like fine jewelry, like embroidery on silk. Dan activated his vision and froze. Se-yeon's mark was different, completely different. For all the others, the brand had been applied by the temple, by priests, according to ritual. For Se-yeon, the brand was hereditary. It hadn't been applied. It had grown, from within, from blood, from lineage. 1,000 years of sacrifices had left a mark in the very blood of the Solwyn house. Every daughter sacrificed added a thread, generation after generation. And by the time Se-yeon was born, the brand was already a part of her. Like the color of her eyes, like the shape of her fingers, she was born with it. Dan looked at the pattern and saw a depth that darkened his eyes. It wasn't a tree, it was a forest. Hundreds of generations, hundreds of girls sacrificed. Each had left a knot, and all the knots had woven into a single web that had lived inside Se-yeon from her first breath. He withdrew his vision. He looked at her. She was waiting. Her face was still calm, still porcelain. Dan said her mark wasn't like the others, that it was hereditary, that it was in her blood. Se-yeon nodded, said she knew, that all the women of the Solwyn clan knew, that the first daughter in every generation is born with lines, thin, imperceptible. They grow throughout her life, slowly, but by the age of 20, they become strong enough for the feeding. And then the temple comes. She said her mother had the same lines, and her grandmother, and her great-grandmother. The difference was that her mother was the second daughter. The first was given away, And Si-yun is the only one. There is no one else to give away but her. Dan asked if he could try. Si-yun looked at him. For the first time, something stirred in her porcelain face. Not hope, fear. The kind of fear that comes when a person is offered something they have forbidden themselves to dream of. She said that if he started and didn't finish, it would be worse. That the family's brand does not forgive interference. That 3 high-ranking sealers had tried to weaken it on her mother. 2 went mad. The 3rd died.
Dan said he wasn't a sealer, that he wouldn't weaken it. He would take it apart. She asked what the difference was. He said that the sealers were pressing from the outside, like trying to break down a wall with a battering ram. But he would pull out the bricks one by one. Si-yun was silent. 10 seconds. 20. Then she said, "All right." And she held out her hands, palms up. Dan took them, dived in, and drowned. The ancestral mark was an ocean. Not an ocean of water, an ocean of lives. He saw them all. The first solven, a girl with copper hair standing on the altar 1,000 years ago. She isn't crying. She is speaking with the abyss. She says she's giving herself up willingly, that it's her choice, that the clan should remember. The abyss accepts, and at that moment, something breaks. Because the girl is lying. She isn't doing this willingly. She was told that if she refused, they'd take her younger sister, and she chose herself. Not out of bravery, out of love, out of fear for her sister. And the abyss sensed the lie, and took her. But not as one takes a gift, as one takes a debtor, with interest, from every generation, from every firstborn daughter, forever. Dan saw this and understood. The ancestral mark is not the abyss's curse, it is a debt, 1,000-year debt for the first solven's lie. And every daughter given up did not pay it off but increased it, because each was led the same way, with the same lie, voluntarily, honorably, sacredly, but in reality, out of fear. And the abyss saw the lie every time and added to the debt. Dan let go of Si-yun's hands. He surfaced. She was looking at him. He was breathing heavily. There was no blood. He hadn't taken it off. He had only looked, but even the sight made his head spin. Si-yun asked what he had seen. Dan told the truth. About the first solven, about the lies, about the debt, about how every generation had increased it. Si-yun listened. Her face changed. The porcelain cracked. Beneath it was something alive and hot and very tired. She said she had always felt it, that volunteering was a game, that there had never been a choice in the family. The first daughter is born and everyone knows. No one says it out loud, but everyone knows. And everyone smiles at her and buys her dresses and takes her to parties and pretends she's an ordinary girl with her whole life ahead of her. But since she was 5, she's felt the lines on her wrists and understood that dresses and parties aren't love. They're an apology. Dan said he could remove it, but not now. Not in 10 minutes. The family mark will demand everything he has, and even more. He needs energy. A lot. More than he's ever had. Se-yun asked how long. Dan said he didn't know, but definitely until the great feeding. Se-yun looked at her hands, at the thin black lines, then at him, and said she would wait. The maid emerged from the darkness. Time was up. Dan stood up. He walked toward the exit. He stopped. He turned around. He told Se-yun one thing, that her ancestors weren't executioners. They were just as frightened as everyone else. The first Soul One didn't betray her family. She saved her sister. And everyone after her did the same. Saved someone at the cost of themselves. It's not guilt. It's love trapped in a cage of fear. Se-yun didn't answer. But something in her face changed. Something very heavy shifted by a millimeter. Like a slab that hadn't been touched in 1,000 years and suddenly shifted. They returned to headquarters an hour before dawn. Cassell hadn't been sleeping. She'd been waiting. She listened in silence. Then she said they had a problem. Orville scheduled a hearing.
In 5 days, Dana is being summoned to the conclave, officially as a witness, unofficially as a defendant. Cassell said that Orville isn't a fool or a fanatic. He's been leading the conclave for 30 years, and in those 30 years, he's never once made a decision based on emotion. He'll gather all the facts, hear all sides, and make a decision that benefits the system, not the people, the system. If Dan is useful to the system, Orville will use him. If he's dangerous, he'll get rid of him. Simple and clean. Dan asked if he could skip it. Haewon said no. A summons from the conclave is not an invitation. If he doesn't show up, they'll send the guard. And if he runs, they'll declare him a heretic in absentia, and then every temple in Velgrave will be obligated to detain him. 5 days. Dan decided to use them. The next morning, he asked Haewon for a favor, to bring him women with the mark, here, in the capital. There must be those who are being prepared, those on whom the brand is growing. Haewon shook her head. She said that the capital's brides were under the temple's protection. They couldn't be approached. But there were others, women who had once been candidates but had been taken away, whose marks were stopped at an early stage and left as a mark, not complete, partial, smoldering. They live in the city, among ordinary people, with black threads under their sleeves, with a headache that won't go away, with nightmares. They are not considered brides. They are considered marked. There are dozens of them in the capital, maybe hundreds. No one has counted. Mira found the first one by noon, a woman named Erin, 32 years old, a seamstress. The brand on her wrists is thin, pale, but alive. It pulses. 12 years. For 12 years she has worn it, and every night she sees the same dream. A black funnel, a stone altar, and a voice that calls. Dan removed her brand in 8 minutes, 4 knots, all based on fear. An old, familiar fear she'd learned to live with, like living with a limp. When Dan was done, Erin sat there touching her wrists, over and over, like a blind person who has regained their sight, touching their face. Then she said the voice had fallen silent, that there was silence in her head. Silence for the first time in 12 years. She left. An hour later they brought in the next one, then another, and another. In 4 days, Dan removed the brands from 19 women, 4 or 5 every day. He was working at his limit. Nosebleeds became routine. His voice would fade by evening and return by morning. Other people's memories piled up, layered upon one another. At night, he'd wake up in a sweat with strangers' names on his lips, the names of children he didn't have, names of husbands he didn't know, addresses of houses he had never lived in. Liora, back in the district, had called it the memory of a curse, the price for removal. The brand doesn't disappear, it passes into him, not as a power, as a memory. And these memories don't fade. They live inside him alongside his own. 19 brands, 19 lives. The energy accumulated from them was immense, more than ever before. Dan felt it as a heaviness in his chest, like pressure from within. It was begging to come out, begging to be released. Yeren watched over him, not like a guard, like a doctor. She kept track. How many he removed each day, how much he slept, how much he ate, how much blood he lost. On the 3rd day she said he was killing himself, that 4 brands a day was too much, that the body could take it, but the mind couldn't, that other people's memories weren't harmless noise, they were a burden, and every person had a limit to how many other lives they could carry before losing their own. Dan said he had no choice, that the conclave is in 2 days, and he has to go there with proof, not with castle's numbers, not with logic, with living proof that can't be denied. Yeren asked what he had in mind. Dan told her. Yeren was silent for a long time. Then she said he was a madman. Then she said it might work. The day of the hearing arrived. The conclave's great hall, round, high ceilings, stone benches in tiers, like that amphitheater where Dan woke up, only bigger and brighter. Torches burned along the walls, candles on the tiers, as bright as day. The printers sat on the benches, 42 people, men and women in dark robes with silver clasps. Orval sat in the center of the upper tier, short, thin, gray hair, a tired face, intelligent, heavy eyes. The eyes of a man who made decisions on which lives depended, and who made none of those decisions lightly. Dana was led in through the main entrance, without an escort. Formally, he is a witness. Cassell and Heywan sat in the lower tier, Mira and Yurin by the door. Orval began to speak, a steady voice, calm. He said that information had reached the conclave about a man who removes the bride's brands, that this is unprecedented, that the conclave must understand exactly what is happening. He asked Dan to explain. Dan stepped into the center of the hall. He stood alone, before 42 sealers who had believed their whole lives that the brand was eternal. He didn't explain. He asked for the oldest living bride to be brought to him, here, in the capital. Orval raised an eyebrow. He exchanged glances with his neighbors, then he nodded. 20 minutes later, the doors opened. An old woman entered, not Eloise, another, older, Evel's mother, the bride of the seal of the capital's temple. She was 87. The brand had held her for 70 years. She was blind, deaf in both ears, hunchbacked so that her head was lower than her shoulders. 2 priestesses led her. She moved her feet an inch at a time. The hall was silent. Everyone knew Mother Ivella. She was a legend, living proof that the system works, that sacrifice makes sense, that the abyss spares the worthy. Dan approached her. She didn't see him, couldn't hear him. But when he took her hands, she turned her head. Something inside her sensed it. He sat down right on the stone floor, in front of her, in front of the entire conclave. He took her palms in his, and began. 70 years, harder than Eloise, deeper, more painful. Ivella had been blind for 10 years, deaf for 20, but she remembered sounds, remembered colors, remembered the face of the man she loved at 17 and whom she was denied, remembered the smell of the sea she had seen once in her childhood. The brand clung to these memories, to everyone, to every piece of life she hadn't lived. Dan pulled the knots, one after another, blood from her nose, then from her ears, then from the corners of her eyes, red trails down her cheeks. The conclave was silent. 42 printers watched, holding their breath. Orval leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. He wasn't looking at the blood. He was looking at Ivella's hands, at the black lines. They were fading, receding, before everyone's eyes, slowly, steadily, like snow melting in the sun. The last knot. Dan could barely see. His eyes were flooded with red, but he could feel it. A small, bright knot right in the center. A 17-year-old girl standing on the seashore, the wind ruffling her hair, and she's laughing. And the brand clings to that laughter, to the last living moment before the altar. Dan untied it. A snap. Silence. He opened his eyes, wiped the blood away, looked at Ivella. There were no lines. 70 years had passed. Her skin is clear, old, wrinkled, but clear. And Ivella blinked, turned her head, looked at Dan, with her eyes, seeing eyes, cloudy, weak, but seeing. 70 years of blindness, and she saw, not clearly, blurs, light, outlines, but she saw. She raised her hands to her face, looked at them, at her fingers, bent them, unbent them, slowly straightened her back, vertebra by vertebra, like Eloise, only longer, more painful, with a crunch. She stood up, swayed. The priestesses rushed to support her. She pushed them away, stood on her own, small, hunchbacked, but standing, on her own. The hall was silent. Orval was silent. Everyone was silent. Ivella turned toward the benches, toward the tiers, toward the people she couldn't see. She said one word, in a hoarse voice she hadn't used in 10 years. She said, "Light." Dan remained on the floor. He couldn't stand up. His legs wouldn't hold him. His arms wouldn't hold him. Mira ran over. She caught him. She sat him down. She leaned him against the wall. Orville stood up. He made his way down the tiers. He approached Dan. He stood before him. He looked down at him for a long time. Then he crouched down, to eye level, and quietly said that now they needed to talk. The conversation with Orville took place in a small chamber behind the conclave hall. A windowless room, a table, 2 chairs, a jug of water. Orville sat across from him, hands on the table, his face calm, like that of a man who had been preparing for this conversation long before Dan appeared in Velgrave. He said he believed his own eyes, that Dan was doing what he was doing, that the brands were being removed, that this was reality. He said the question wasn't whether Dan could. The question was what would happen next. If Dan continued to remove the brands, the system would collapse. Not the abyss, the system, the temples, the conclave, the noble houses, everything that has held Velgrave together for 1,000 years. Because the system stands on a single pillar, on the fact that sacrifice is necessary. Remove the pillar and everything will collapse. Dan listened. Orville continued speaking. He said he understood Dan, that he himself had wanted to stop the feeding many times, that every bride he approved of was a knife to his own heart. But he approved them, because the alternative is worse. Without the feeding, the abyss will rise within a year. Pustules will cover the entire land. Beasts will pour forth. Shadows will spread. In 5 years, nothing would remain. He said that Dan could be the solution, not the one Dan imagined. Better, cleaner, 1 person instead of thousands. Dan would become the living seal. The conclave would provide him with everything he needed: food, blood, protection, help. And once every few years, he would take into himself what the brides used to take. No sacrifices, no deaths, no altars. Progress. Orville called it progress. Dan looked at him, at his weary face, at his hands that didn't tremble, at his eyes that believed every word he spoke, and he saw. Not for nothing, with ordinary eyes. Orville is no villain. Orville is a man who for 30 years made impossible choices and each time chose the lesser evil. And now he saw an even lesser evil. 1 person instead of thousands. The logic is flawless. The math adds up. Everything is correct, except for one thing. Dan said that the abyss does not eat life. It eats grief. Orville did not understand. Dan explained. The chamber of names, the channel of sorrow, waves of abscesses after every feeding, the castle data, a pattern. Every feeding does not sate the abyss, but makes it hungrier. And the great feeding will trigger a wave that will destroy Velgrave in 3 years. Orville listened. His face remained unchanged. When Dan finished, he was silent for a minute. Then he said he'd seen the data, that his own scribes had seen the same trend, that he knew the feedings were weakening. But, he said but there is no alternative. If we don't feed it, the abyss will rise now. If we feed it, it will rise in 3 years. 3 years is better than now. 3 years is time to find a real solution. Dan said that a real solution already exists. Orville raised an eyebrow. Dan said that the abyss is not a monster, not a hungry beast. It is grief. 1,000 years worth of grief from all the girls who were sacrificed, every one of whom wasn't told she was needed alive, every one of whom was led to the altar and told it was an honor. The abyss didn't ask for lives. It asked for someone to come and say, enough, that you are needed here, that you matter alive, not dead. And instead, for 1,000 years, they gave her new grief, new fear, new pain, and she starved even more. Orville listened. For the first time, something shifted in his face. Not conviction, doubt. A small one, like a crack. He asked how Dan knew this. Dan said he had been inside, that the vortex had passed through him, that he had heard the voices of all the sacrificed, thousands, and not a single one spoke of hunger, They all spoke of loneliness. Orville was silent for a long time. Then he stood up, walked across the room, stopped by the wall, with his back to Dan, and said quietly that if Dan was right, then he, Orville, had killed thousands of girls over 30 years, not saved them, killed them. Because everyone he sent to the altar didn't feed the abyss, she fed her own hunger. Dan didn't answer, because there was no answer. Orville turned around. His eyes were wet. His face was stony. He said he couldn't cancel the great feeding, not because he didn't believe, because if he canceled it, and Dan turned out to be wrong, the world would perish. And if Dan was right, the world would perish a little later. The risk is the same, but the responsibility is different. Dan said he wasn't asking to cancel it. He was asking for a chance. 3 months, to let him work, to remove the brands, to close the abscesses, to gather enough strength so that on the day of the great feeding, he could stand on the altar instead of the 7 brides, just like back then, on the first day, 1 step. Orville asked what would happen if the abyss didn't accept him. Dan said it would accept him, because he would come without fear, without sorrow, without the lie of voluntariness. He would come because he had decided to, and he would tell her what hadn't been said in 1,000 years. Orville asked what exactly. Dan said that when the time came, he would know. Orville looked at him. Then he sat back down. Then he said he was giving him 2 months, not 3, 2. If the situation with the abscesses didn't improve in 2 months, the great feeding would take place as planned. If it improves, the conclave will consider it. Not approve, reconsider. Dan nodded. It was more than he'd expected. Orville stood up. He walked to the door. He stopped. Without turning around, he said that if Dan was right, then he, Orville, would spend the rest of his life answering for the dead, and that he preferred to believe Dan was wrong, because it was easier to live with that. Dan said nothing. Orville left. Dan remained alone in the windowless room. 2 months, hundreds of abscesses, thousands of brands, and one abyss that had waited 1,000 years for someone to come, not with a sacrifice, but with what it had actually asked for. 2 months. Dan broke them down into parts. For the first 3 weeks, he worked in the south. Hawan gathered all the hunters from the 3 sectors, 72 women. Of them, 26 had residual or partial marks. Dan removed 3 a day. He couldn't do more. Yurin watched over him. She counted. She made him eat. She made him sleep. Mira carried water and food and never strayed more than 10 steps from him. Cassell coordinated. She mapped the abscesses by priority, which were closest to the villages, which were growing the fastest, which could be sealed with the available energy. Dan sealed 2 abscesses a week, each time giving everything he had stored up, emptying himself, and starting over. Remove the brand, accept the pain, accumulate, give to the earth, close the wound, remove the next one. An assembly line, warehouse work, accept, process, give. By the end of the 3rd week, he had closed 8 blisters in the southern sector, 8 out of 14. Hawan stood at the edge of the last one closed and looked at the clean ground. For the first time in 20 years of command, her face was not stony. It was bewildered. She said that in those 3 weeks, no one from her unit had died. For the first time in 5 years. Not a single girl, not a single one. She said that and fell silent, and turned away, and her shoulders trembled once. Then she straightened up and walked toward the unit to give orders. Dan didn't see her face. He didn't need to. Liora arrived from the district at the start of the 4th week. She brought records, a complete systematization of all the removed brands, types of knots, depth, attachment points, methods of removal. She had formatted it as a treatise, not for Dan, for those who would come after him. Because if Dan was right, and if the method could be passed on, then one day he wouldn't be the only one removing the brands. Dan read the treatise. He looked at Liora. She was standing in front of him, waiting, like a student waiting for a grade. He said it was the best thing anyone had done for him since he'd arrived in Velgrave. Liora blushed. She turned away. Then she turned back and said she wanted to try, to remove a brand, by herself. Dan fell silent. He didn't know if the gift could be passed on. He didn't know if it was possible to teach someone to see the knots. But Liora bore a brand herself. She knew how it worked from the inside, not theoretically, on her own skin. He said they'd try. They started the next day. Liora sat across from a woman with a mild, early-stage mark. Dan was beside her. He placed his hand on Leora's shoulder and opened her vision, and tried to show her, not tell her, show. Here's the knot. Here's the attachment point. Here's what it's holding on to. Liora closed her eyes, her face tensed. A second, 2, 5. She opened her eyes and said she could see it, not clearly, not sharply, like through a fogged-up window, but she could see it, the shadow of the knot, the outline. She reached out and touched the woman's wrist, and pulled, gently, hesitantly, but she pulled. The knot wavered. It didn't give way, but it wavered. Liora withdrew her hand. She looked at Dan. Her eyes were huge. There was no fear in them. There was something in them that made Dan's throat tighten. She realized she could do it. Not now, not tomorrow, but she could. Dan finished the job for her. He removed the brand. But something had shifted, something important. If Liora could see it, then others could too. The former brides, those who knew the brand from the inside, those whom Dan had already freed. They could become more than just the saved. They could become the saviors. The next 3 weeks were the hardest. Dan worked in and around the capital. He closed abscesses. He removed brands. He taught Liora. Liora learned quickly. By the end of the 5th week, she could remove a mild, early-stage brand on her own. Slower than Dan, more carefully, but on her own, without his hands, only with his presence nearby. By the end of the 6th week, 2 more had joined her. Tame from the Temple District, and Erin, a seamstress from the capital. Both former bearers of marks. Both had begun to see the knots, faintly, on the verge, but they saw them. Dan realized that the gift was not unique. He was simply the first to take the step. But the step could be repeated. Any woman who had borne a brand and been freed carried within her the memory of the curse, and that memory could become sight. Erin organized everything. She called it a workshop, not a temple, not an order, a workshop, a place where they mend. Liora kept the records. Tame worked on the mild cases. Erin helped with housing and caring for those who had just had their brand removed and couldn't stand yet. Mira handled security and logistics and food and everything else that no one thought about until she did it. Castle kept the tally. By the end of the 7th month since Dan's arrival in Velgrava, the overall total was as follows. 83 brands removed, 21 abscesses closed, 3 students capable of removing mild brands on their own. The wave of abscesses in the southern sector had stopped. For the first time in 20 years, the curve was not rising. Castle brought this data to Orval. Orval looked at the numbers, for a long time, in silence. Then he said that 2 months had passed, and that he was convening the conclave to decide on the great feeding. But Dan already knew that the numbers weren't enough. Orval might see the improvement and decide that they could continue without the feeding. Or he might decide that the improvement was temporary and that the feeding was still needed as a safety net. Logic allowed for both conclusions. Something more was needed, and Dan knew what. He asked for a meeting with Sayan, a second one. This time not in the garden at night, at the Solvin residence, during the day, officially. Orval had given his permission. Dan arrived with Lior and Erin. Sayan met them in the great hall. She was wearing a dark, long-sleeved dress. The brand had grown. Dan could see it clearly through the fabric. The lines reached her shoulders and were beginning climbing toward his neck. 3 months until the feeding. The mark was in a hurry. He said he was ready. Sayan looked at him, at his gaunt face, at the dark circles under his eyes, at his hands, which trembled slightly when he wasn't watching them. She asked if he was really ready, or if he just wanted to be ready. Dan said it was the same thing. He sat down across from her. He held out his hands. She placed hers on top. He dove into the 1,000-year-old ocean of the Solvan lineage and began to unravel it. It took 4 hours. Liora sat nearby, resting a hand on his shoulder, learning, watching, and memorizing. Yeren stood by the door, watching his breathing and the color of his face, and every 30 minutes made him drink water without breaking his trance. 4 hours, 1,000 years, generation after generation. Dan was unpacking the family debt brick by brick. Every solvan, every daughter, every lie about it being voluntary, every fear for the younger sister, every mother who knew her firstborn wouldn't live past 30 and sang lullabies anyway. He lived through them all. Over 100 lives. Short, vivid lives cut short by the altar. He wasn't crying from pain, from the fact that every one of these women had loved. Everyone had walked to the altar not for the abyss, but for someone, and not once did anyone ask any of them if she wanted to live. When he reached the root, the first solvan, the girl with copper hair who lied for her sister's sake, he didn't tear the knot, he untied it, carefully, gently, just as one unties a ribbon on an old letter. And he told her, not with words, with something deeper than words, that her sister had survived, that the line had continued, that for 1,000 years her daughters had carried her choice, and each of them had loved just as deeply, and that now it was enough, that the debt had been paid, not with blood, with love, 1,000 times. The knot melted away. It didn't snap, it didn't break, it melted away, and with it, everything else crumbled. 1,000 years, like a house of cards. Dan opened his eyes. He was lying on the floor. He didn't remember when he'd fallen. Blood on his face, on his hands, on the stone. Se-yun was sitting on a chair. Her hands were clean. Her neck was clean. Beneath the fabric of her dress, he knew there were no more lines. 1,000 years of the Solvan lineage, erased. Not like wine, like a disease that had finally been cured. Se-yun looked at her wrists. She touched her skin, clean, warm. Then she looked up, and for the first time since they'd known each other, her face wasn't porcelain. It was alive, tired, beautiful, alive. The day of the great feeding had arrived. The conclave hadn't canceled it. Orville couldn't. Too much was at stake. Too many houses, too many temples, too many people had been waiting for this for 50 years. But Orville did one thing. He didn't forbid Dan from coming. The capital altar was enormous, not that small amphitheater where Dan had woken up. It was a circular hall the size of a square, 7 altars in a ring, black stones, stone rings for hands, torches, candles, and people, thousands, on the tiers all around, the entire conclave, all the nobility, all the temples, all of Velgrava was watching. 6 girls in white lay on 6 altars, bound, eyes closed, lips moving. The bride's hymn, that very one. The 7th altar was empty, Se-yun's altar. Orval stood in the center of the ring. He looked at the empty altar. He looked at Dan, who was standing by the railing, and said nothing. A vortex began to form, not 1, 7, above each altar, black, spinning, a rumbling, pressure. My teeth are chattering, my vision is darkening, just like then, on the first day, only 7 times stronger. Dan stepped over the railing. He didn't run, he walked, slowly, toward the center of the ring. The priests parted, not because he was pushing them away, because they saw his face, and there was no fear on that face. He stood in the center, 7 vortexes around him, 7 streams stretched toward the 6 girls, the 7th toward the empty altar. Dan closed his eyes and called out, not to the craters, to the abyss, to everything beneath the earth, to the entire ocean of grief, to all the hunger, all the loneliness. He didn't scream, he didn't command, he simply opened himself up, like opening a door. Come in. The 7 funnels trembled, froze, and then turned, all 7, from the girls toward him. 7 streams merged into one. A single black pillar struck Dan from above. He fell to his knees, just like then, palms pressed against the stone. But this time he wasn't holding on. He was receiving 1,000 years of grief, Tens of thousands of voices, every bride, every mother, every daughter, every sister. They were all here, in this stream, not angry, not hungry, lonely, infinitely lonely. And for the first time, Dan told them what no one had told them for 1,000 years, not with words, with something deeper. He said they were needed alive, that each of them was needed alive, that they were taken not because it had to be done, but because everyone was afraid, and that enough was enough now, that he was here, that he had come not out of fear, not for a reward, simply because he couldn't stand by, like back then, under the bookshelf, like back then, at the first altar, like always. The stream faltered, 1,000 voices fell silent. For a single second, absolute silence fell over the hall, and then the voices sounded again, but differently. Not a shout, not a whisper, a breath, a long, quiet breath, like a person who had been holding their breath their whole life and finally let it out. And then Liora stood behind him. She placed her hand on his shoulder. She didn't speak to him, to the abyss, that she was here too, that she was the bride, that she had been bound to the stone, and that she was alive, and that she chose to be here, not because she had to, because she wanted to. Behind Liora stood Yeren, a hand on Leora's shoulder. Yeren, who for years had walked the younger ones to the altar and remained silent. She was no longer silent. Behind Yeren stood Cassel. She didn't believe in miracles. She believed in numbers, and her numbers said that this person on the floor was changing the world. That was enough. Behind Cassel stood Mira, 17 years old. She had lost her sister. She had found peace on a warm stone by the road. She stood there and did not smile. For the first time, she didn't need to smile to keep from crying. Behind Mira stood Heywan. 20 years of funerals, 20 years of girls who never returned. She stood like an old sword stuck in the ground, heavy, unbreakable, and for the first time in 20 years, not carrying the dead on her shoulders. Behind Heywan stood Seyon, the last one, the princess of a clan that for 1,000 years fed the abyss with its daughters. She did not come as a bride. She came as a woman who, for the first time in her life, was making her own choice. 7 women behind 1 man. And each gave not a life, not strength, not a sacrifice. Each gave what the abyss had asked for 1,000 years. Presence, voluntary, warm, alive. I am here. I see you. You are not alone. Dan felt something change. The current no longer pressed down. It flowed, through him, through them, like a river that had found its course after 1,000 years without banks. The abyss drank, but not life, not sorrow, not fear. It drank what it had been starving for all this time. Love. Simple, ordinary human love. Not sacrificial, not heroic. The kind that comes when one person tells another, I'm here, and stays. The current began to weaken, slowly. The vortex settled. Black turned to gray, gray to transparent, transparent to empty. The voices faded away, one by one. They didn't die. They were set free. Each voice was a girl who had finally heard what she'd wanted to hear for 1,000 years. I need you alive. And each one didn't fade into darkness, into silence, into peace, into the place where it no longer hurts. The funnel collapsed, quietly, not with an explosion, with an exhalation, like a child who had finally been embraced. The hall was silent. Thousands of people were silent. On the 6 altars, 6 girls opened their eyes. The black lines on their wrists faded, disappearing. The ropes on the rings went slack. No one was pulling anymore. No one was drinking. Dan was kneeling in the center of the ring, 7 hands on his shoulders and back. He was breathing, heavily, hoarsely, but he was breathing. The blood on his face had dried. There was no new blood. Inside he felt empty, not heavy, not painful, empty. All the voices were gone, all the memories, all the lives of others, gone to where they should have gone long ago, to rest. He opened his eyes. He looked down, at the stone floor, where the altars had stood. The black stone was cracking, not crumbling, changing. Something was pushing through the cracks, green, delicate, alive, grass, on the altar stone.
on the black stone that had drunk the lives of others for 1,000 years. Grass. Dawn broke through the hall's tall windows. The red sky was fading, turning pink, then blue. For the first time in 1,000 years, the sky above the capital was simply the sky, without red, without craters, without pressure, just morning. Sion stood behind him, alive, free. All 6 brides on the altars were alive, free. Eloise was sleeping somewhere far away without nightmares. Yahello looked out the window with clear eyes. Tame was smiling. Nell was breathing deeply. Sunye wasn't trembling. Aaron didn't hear voices. 83 women with clear skin were living their lives. 21 abscesses closed and would not open. 3 students who see the knots and know how to untie them. 1 workshop that will become 10. 10 that will become 100. The world hadn't changed overnight. The abyss hadn't vanished. It was still down there, underground. But it was no longer hungry. It was sleeping. For the first time in 1,000 years, sated, not by sacrifices, by what they gave her instead of sacrifices. Orval stood on the upper tier. He watched the grass pushing through the altar stone. His face was wet. He didn't wipe it. Dan slowly stood up. His legs were shaking. Mira offered her shoulder. He leaned on it. He looked at his wrist, a thin black line. 1. The only one. It didn't pull. It didn't hurt. It didn't grow. It just was. A mark. A memory. A reminder that he had taken a step. He didn't remove it. Liora stood nearby. She looked at his wrist, then at him. He said it was his, not a brand, not a curse, just a mark, to remember. They left the hall at dawn. The city was waking up, an ordinary morning. Smoke from the chimneys, voices in the streets, dogs barking, children running somewhere. The sky was blue. Mira walked beside him and said nothing. Then she said she was hungry. Dan said he was too. Castle said she knew a place with good porridge. Yeren said he should wash up first because he had blood on him and was scaring passers-by. Hey. She didn't say anything. She walked and looked at the sky, at the blue morning sky, and her lips twitched, once, almost a smile. Sion walked last, quiet, upright, without porcelain on her face, without lines on her skin, without 1,000 years on her shoulders, just a 21-year-old girl who, for the first time in her life, was walking wherever she wanted. Dan turned around. He looked at them, at all of them, at the 6 women who had been standing behind him when the abyss came, each of whom he had shaped in his own way. For one, he found a task for her hands. To another, he gave the chance to save. For the third, he turned calculations into a tool for life. For the fourth, he restored peace for her sister. To the fifth, he gave a unit where no one dies. For the sixth, he lifted 1,000 years of guilt. And each of them stood behind him not because he asked, because she wanted to, on her own, for themselves, not for his sake. That was the most important thing. Not that he saved the world, but that they learned to want to live, for themselves, not for the altar, not for their clan, not for duty, for themselves. He turned back. He walked on, down the street, toward the smell of porridge. It was an ordinary morning, warm, quiet, the first morning of a new world in which no girl would ever lie down on the altar.